Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for July 26th, 2024. Today's Friday, so I'll be taking your questions. And let's start with one that came in just before I started. It says, you speak of China's intervention for peace in Gaza and Ukraine, but what leverage does China have with Netanyahu and Zelensky? And will the U.S. allow China to get involved? Well, those are good questions. The question of China's leverage is that China is doing this as an honest broker. That the U.S. is saying that China is helping Russia through providing weapons and doing everything they can to help the Russian war effort. Well, it's true, China and Russia have a unique partnership right now. But the central feature of that partnership is the exemplification of Xi Jinping's idea of a win-win relationship. And what that means in terms of Russia and China is economic cooperation and strategic cooperation. And it was what was laid out by Putin in his Eurasian Perspective address, where he basically said that Russia will work with any country that wants to be involved in the process of Eurasian development, including any NATO country and the United States. And what does he mean by Eurasian economic development? Well, that's the broad space that Russia covers, but it includes Asian countries, South Asian countries, China, the Koreas, and his open invitation to Europe to join goes against the British geopolitical doctrine, which says that Europe must never be a partner or allowed to join with Eurasian powers, because that's the ability to control the world's landmass. And for the British geopoliticians, the initial idea of geopolitics was to keep British control of the oceans as a way they could control trade and credit policy to defend the empire. Now, what Putin's talking about is the ability to break the power of the unipolar order, to create what some call a multipolar order, or Chaz Freeman calls a multinodal order, with the idea being not that you have poles that are deployed against each other, but different relationships. And this is exactly what Putin is talking about. Now, Xi Jinping in China, what's their involvement with Ukraine? They don't want to see a war. They know this could become a nuclear war. They're watching the West becoming more and more frantic about Ukraine losing. And so the intervention with Ukraine was to say to Ukraine, look, you had an offer on the table. You signed it back in 2022. Let's get back to that. Let's work this out, and then we can start talking about reconstructing your country. And the way to reconstruct it would be something that was worked out actually with Yanukovych before the Maidan coup in 2014, which was that Ukraine and China have an agreement that would include energy, transportation, interconnectedness between Ukraine through Russia and China. It was a big picture. And this is why Yanukovych did not want to have an exclusive relationship with the European Union. And it was on this, to stop that Yanukovych was overthrown in the Maidan coup. So the question for China is win-win economic cooperation. Now, the same thing is true with Israel and Palestine. There's going to need to be a massive rebuilding project to rescue Gaza from the destruction that was done by the Israelis. And the one country that could be part of that would be China. China's already been discussing with Iran, with Iraq, with Syria, with the Saudis, the Belt and Road Initiative coming through Southwest Asia. So it's a natural fit. Now, as to what the U.S. wants, Well, it depends on who's running the U.S. If it stays in the hands of the war hawks, they're going to do everything they can to stop this, including launching a war against China on the pretext of defending the independence of Taiwan, knowing full well that Taiwan is not independent, but by law it's recognized as part of China. So the problem you have is, as long as the U.S. is the international lawbreaker, you're not going to have a willingness of the United States to allow China to carry through economic projects that will benefit everyone in the region, everyone in the world. So the real issue here is not China. China's doing what it intends to do and what it has done successfully so far with the Belt and Road Initiative. The question is, will the people of the United States insist on a U.S. government that will support these kinds of economic development projects, which are the basis for a sustainable peace? So we'll see what happens in the Southwest Asia question, Gaza, and so on. But the Chinese have made an unmistakable potential shift in the region, and this is part of what Putin and Xi Jinping have been talking about in terms of a Eurasian perspective and a tectonic shift away from a unipolar order. Now, second question, I was disgusted by Netanyahu's speech to the Congress, especially watching the over-the-top reaction of U.S. congressmen. Are all of them bought by AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee? Well, I don't know if all of them are bought, but a whole lot of them are. AIPAC is a major contributor through both direct contributions and through its super PAC. Money talks a lot to these congressmen, but it's not just the money for their congressional campaigns. Many of them look at the post-congressional career. Can they get jobs? Who's going to hire them? This is partly how the military-industrial financial complex stays in power. That you have people like Lloyd Austin, for example, who goes to the board of Raytheon when he left the Army. Now, in terms of the Congress, there's huge flow of funds into the congressional campaigns. And AIPAC is somewhat smart in that they give to both sides. But the problem is that the money that's going to the Congress and shaping the congressional support for Netanyahu's policy of genocide doesn't take into consideration that a growing number of Americans have turned against the U.S. complicity with Israel in the campaign against the Palestinian people. And we saw that with the demonstrations on the campuses last summer or last spring. So part of the question is, what happens now? If Israel continues to refuse to sign the ceasefire agreement that Hamas is willing to sign, will the American population turn against Israel? And if so, then the question becomes, how much money does AIPAC have to shell out to keep the Congress under control? I think the isolation of Israel by the rest of the world and the fact that the votes in the United Nations show that the U.S. is now being isolated offer a very compelling reason why the AIPAC money will not be enough to sustain the control of the Congress. But that depends on leadership, and that depends on the problem that we have of every single major candidate, including Bobby Kennedy Jr., is pro-Netanyahu or pro-Israel. So this is a question of the organizing that we have to do to get the American people who don't support these wars to come out and start speaking out. Now, the last question, and this is a complicated one, and I'll just take it on the simple level. Jeremiah pointed out that Bill Binney said that the Executive Order 12333 was used against Trump in Russiagate. And this executive order is one which defines when and how U.S. intelligence agencies can engage in surveillance outside the United States. And what Jeremiah said is this was used in the LaRouche case also. And he said, given this, Shouldn't Trump exonerate LaRouche to expose the corruption of the Justice Department and FBI targeting? Well, that was something that we had asked for during the whole time of Trump's first presidency. And it would have made sense because the same networks that targeted Trump had already run these operations against LaRouche in the 80s. The Get LaRouche Task Force, in terms of its Boston case, was headed by Robert Mueller, the same Robert Mueller who was deployed then for the Get Trump Task Force. And the same agencies, the FBI, the CIA, the National Security Agency, that were deployed against Trump were also deployed against LaRouche first. And LaRouche ended up with a 5-year prison sentence on a fraudulent conviction that Ramsey Clark, the former U.S. Attorney General, said was the worst case of government persecution that he had ever seen. So, if Trump gets back in, what's he going to do to deal with the so-called deep state? We'll start with exposure. Release the full JFK assassination files. Release all the Russiagate files. And release the LaRouche files. Exonerate Lyndon LaRouche. Make it clear that LaRouche was a target of this permanent bureaucracy or secret government, the same one that targeted Trump. And what was the reason that LaRouche was targeted? Because he was working with Ronald Reagan on a project to eliminate the threat of nuclear war by having a U.S.-Soviet joint development of the Strategic Defense Initiative, the anti-missile beam system that Reagan liked and endorsed, but was shut down by Kissinger and others through the targeting of LaRouche and forcing Reagan to break with LaRouche. So if Trump really wants to clean up the swamp, start there. Start with the intersection of the intelligence agencies with the military-industrial financial complex on behalf of war, because that's how they operate. They're committed to war and confrontation and provocations, and that's what we see all across the board. So if Trump wishes to clean up the swamp, and I think he does, because he knows that that's what came up and destroyed his opportunity to have a second term back in 2020, if he really wants to do something to not for himself but for the nation, let's address this so-called deep state or permanent bureaucracy and clean it up. So I thank you for your questions. People should look at the webcast that I'm going to be connecting to the link to the description section to hear what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has to say on these issues. So have a good weekend. See you next week. Hello. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.